People think that African art is sculpture only. But if you look at the Nigerian heritage, for instance, at one pole is the naturalism of the Ife bronzes and terracottas. The heads are very realistic. And then at the other extreme is Uli painting, which is essentially abstract. And in between, you have a whole range of styles. So the heritage in Nigeria already has the full gamut of styles. For the contemporary African artist, it was essential to go back to his tradition, borrow from it, but at the same time, to be aware of other traditions of the world and weld them together. The artists have derived inspiration from Uli, wall painting and body decoration of the Igbo people. The qualities of simplicity, of linearity, as well as spontaneity and directness. These were the things that attracted these artists to Uli. And this has been reflected in their works. I think it's important to make the linkage between the art of the past and that of the present, which is what the artists of Nsukka have done in going back to Uli as a point of departure.
Well, the Uli tradition is essentially a female tradition. It's the females in Igbo society who were the people who developed this, because they used the Uli forms to decorate themselves, to decorate the walls of homes. During festival time, they were asked to help with decorating public shrines and so on.
Nature is the source for the artist. The organization of nature, the structuring of cells, the structuring of plants, trees, the relationship between the earth, bodies of water, the sky, and so on. It's also the painting done by women on the walls, mud walls of shrines or private houses. The forms remain basically abstract. They are more or less like signs or summaries of the original models. So that basically is Uli. The line is very central to it, clean, lyrical line. Large open spaces are also part of this tradition as a counterpoint to areas of detailing and texture. The Poetics of Line, 7 artists of the Nsukka group, features the works of a selection of artists from Nsukka. They have either trained or taught at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. Nsukka is in southeastern Nigeria, and the university was the first indigenous university in Nigeria because it was the first to award its own degree. What this exhibition has done particularly for the American public, is to show that African art did not end or die with the classical or traditional masterpieces. If anything, there is very vigorous work going on in Africa today. Ache Okeke's work, I believe, is the one closest to classical Uli, and it is reflected in his style and the themes of his work.
Makedo Afanka.
Nke wifa ọkpọ ọkụkọ eji were emeju nke eti.
Ache Okeke is the chief exponent of Uli in modern Nigerian art. He was the first to begin to experiment seriously with the forms of Uli way back in the early 60s.
Well, I think the first thing is should I say, the design aspect. The design aspect is the innovation that I brought when I got to the university, and that was the introduction of Uli as a way of expression. That is, the traditional Uli was transformed and used to teach. And we had to experiment using the different motifs and symbols of the traditional Uli artists. First, we looked at the general theory, the basics. That is, the problem of drawing as expressed in the West. Yes. That's using geometric forms. And of course, the organic system used in the traditional, which is of course Uli. So we had to, get these different motifs, analyzed them, and we tried to use them to express ourselves in the modern idiom. The motifs were, of course, based on materials, objects, useful objects, man-made, pots, metal design, that is iron, mongery, and all kinds of motifs on murals, walls. And we wanted to relate to our environment, relate our art, artistic expressions to our environment. That was very important for us, to create our own new art culture. It meant doing some figurative work, making drawings based on the spirit world, learned from our folklore. And of course, trying to reflect the natural world as would be done by our ancestors. I mean, these are some of the things I wanted to do in my own way. Yeah. So it's my own expression. I see my work as my own contribution to contemporary art. Because revival, I don't like even the word revival. You don't wake up a dead person and ask him to live. What one will see is this organic kind of transformation, change, rather than trying to beat a dead horse, make it live. Because that's dangerous for any culture or any civilization. I think things should grow one into the other, and there should be change. That's an aspect of life.
Chike Aniakor makes very bold shapes, which are almost monumental. And within this basic statement, he adds intricate linear statements.
My work is rooted very much in the idiom of expression. I try to carry a few things like watercolor, then I ink, and because I can move them around, it enables me to work, as it were, on the spot and take seize on opportunities. Now, I work from sketches mostly, but I also don't allow sketches to dominate my own thinking and creative vision. So what I try to do is, when I prepare sketches, I only allow them to become merely inspirational in the sense that I carry them in my mind as visual epithets and stock phrases from which I can draw on when I begin to formulate my ideas. And I'm now able to provide broad zones, which will serve as visual containers for various images. Then even then, I also allow the surrounding space. So the contrast between the surrounding space will provide visual tension, so that even what is here, the negative space here, is also placed in tension in relation with a strong boundary, which in turn re-echoes the surrounding space. So what I now do is I'm now balancing out, getting some details, allowing and seeing how details can help me, as it were, temper the white areas without necessarily, so that I can still retain some levels of visual tension between the dark and the light areas.
Do you use specific uli designs or just
Yes,
the general quality of them?
Yes, quality, because once you get used to the gestures, then you begin to invent the gestures. And the idea is no longer a conscious use of uli elements. So literally, you now begin to have zones, almost like in wall painting. You begin to have zones. They become visual containers. Within that, you can reach certain levels of experience, but then they interrelate. So that these ones seem to become the broad parent-shaped binders in the whole composition. Yeah. Having gotten the composition out, I'm now looking at the general distribution of pictorial elements and seeing which area weighs more than the other. So having worked more spontaneously, gradually now you become a little more methodical, where you now begin to distribute elements and more critically now assess things, because as it were, the freedom of creativity has been well established.
What I can say about Obiora Udechukwu is that he has used uli as a tool for responding to the social and political conditions in Nigeria. Everyone has an identity. Everyone has a background, a heritage. And for me, uli is my heritage. So when I became conscious of returning to my roots, uli became the thing that was immediately available. So for me, it's a means of understanding myself, understanding my tradition, and using that as a basis for encountering other traditions. There seem to be three broad periods in my work. The first period is a period where I was still working within the conventional idiom on which I was brought up from primary school, secondary school. The second part would then be the period where I used uli very seriously and spent all my time developing it. And the third period is the more recent period when I'm beginning to break away from black and white and moving back to painting and exploring other things, especially color, as color, almost as an end in itself. But I think the main thing which interests me in this experiment now is the texture which one sees in woolly wall painting, the background texture, which is like a geometrical monochromatic pattern, which provides the background on which the painting or the motifs are situated. It is on this ground that the woolly patterns or drawings are placed. Let's say that each artist responds to situations according to his personality and background. Having said that, I think one would recognize that the intensity of experience that one went through during the Nigerian Civil War is largely responsible for this social concern in my work. My work and the works of a few other younger artists tend to address the disillusionment with the country and Africa in general, the failure of leadership, what somebody has termed reckless politics. You find that occasionally people don't want to be reminded of this so-called tragic side of our life. You know, people want to forget that there are human beings who are suffering, that there are refugees. But I've been a refugee, I know what it means. You know, so when I read about Somalia, about Bosnia, and all kinds of things happening now, it makes sense to me, you know. So that my work is not just talking about Biafra, but talking about humanity, about the history of man on this planet, and the enigma that man is. Anatsui is a magician with wood. You get the impression that you're looking at sculpture and looking at painting, looking at drawing, and looking at textiles all at the same time.
The way the chainsaw cut into the wood, you know, reminded me of, or took my mind back, the experience of the continent of Africa long ago when the colonialists arrived and started cutting almost everything. Something like cutting our culture into bits, slashing it into bits, you know. And you'll find that most of my teams these days are concerned with the history of Africa. Yeah, with the incidence of colonialism very paramount in it. Well, the chainsaw is a very rough and raw material, you know, and very limited in scope. You know, when it cuts, there are a lot of woolly ends that it leaves, and you have to have a way of removing them. There's no other way except fire. And I find out that the fire gives the cuts a certain amount of unity because it gives them the black configuration, you know, which lends unity. Now, this came in sort of unconsciously, but on conscious reflection now, I can relate it to so many other art forms which are in my culture. This idea of the strip woven cloth, where you don't have a cloth woven full width, but you have it done in strips which are brought together. So in a way, one can unconsciously relate this idea of using strips of wood to that tradition. Certainly, I used uli. Most of the times, Western scholars might say, oh, Africans cannot abstract because abstraction is something that the intellect has to, you know, come in a lot, and these people don't have intellect. Therefore, when I came into Nigeria and met Uche and his uli movement and efforts, I was naturally drawn to it. So that I was using both Uli and Adinkra symbols. I look at the textures of my work process, and I think about the texture and grain of Africa's history. I look at the authentic colors of the different types of wood, and they remind me of the real colors of Africa's history. I contemplate the directions of the large populations of mobile figures, and they replicate the migrations in Africa's history. I look at the variegated circumstances on the face of a large figure just created, and the feeling takes me across the face of Africa's history.
Chike Adenaike is a master watercolor painter, and he uses the human face as a potent instrument for making his statements.
Those faces that you see come out from my mind.
Yeah.
And there's the need to say this. If I look at you, the only way I can read your emotion is by looking at your face. That's true. If my face is taken away from my body, and if it was still possible that I'd be alive, without moving, if I'm still seated the way I am now, you can tell how I feel. If I focus on a face, or the face appears in my work, then you can tell whether this is a happy face or a sad face. And from there you can begin to read meaning into my work. But I want people to be able to relate to whatever I do. And of course, I've always believed that essentially my art is human. How do you show that humanity if not you use a face? I think I've moved slightly off faces. Watercolor as a medium is rather subtle. When you think of the level of transparencies that one can achieve with watercolor, you know that it's rather very, very subtle. One would expect that perhaps with watercolor, the best that one can get is landscape paintings, market scenes where you just put little dabs here and there, and then the entire picture is made. But I'm different. I don't do landscapes, for example. I don't paint market scenes, what I call genre. I do things that are more intuitive.
Obiora Udechukwu's works are like analogs of poetry, very epigrammatic, concise, and very elegant.
Even though I studied English or literature, I've always been interested in art, and my mother is an artist. And so as I grew up, I was always exposed to art, and I always drew and painted at some level. When I started the fabrics, which is really the first thing I seriously started doing, I was very much influenced by the Uli motifs. And at that time, I used to make use of them. But as the years have gone by and I've gained more facility with my material and more experience, I would say that I work in a linear style, because very often I create my own motifs or I adapt. And I've always had a tendency, let's say, towards clean lines and simplicity. Silence has always meant a lot to me, and I think I say a lot by my silences in my work and as a person, the way I operate. At the time I was in the United States for a length of time, I was very young and in the formative stages of my life, really. But what that time probably did for me was to give me another culture. It's true that I come from a mixed marriage, and of course there are two cultures at work. And in fact, I think it's slightly a bit of a handicap for me in a way, though I've always tried to handle it positively. This aspect of belonging to two cultures and perhaps not being fully in either one. The poetry served its own purpose at a particular time for me, just as my art serves its own purpose. They are both emotional outlets. I have to say that first and foremost. I wasn't trained as an artist, and I never really took myself as an artist per se. I mean, in terms of this is a career and this is how I'm going to earn my living. And so my art, literary and visual, has always been, first and foremost for me, a way of bringing out feelings. And that's why both are very emotional. They help me to deal with my life.
Olu Oguibe is a protean character, almost an artist of no nationality, an artist of the world, who moves from one style to the other, from one theme to the other, and is somebody you cannot pin down. It's like a masquerade dancing.
Much of my adulthood in Nigeria I spent within the academic community. I spent very little time outside of Nsukka. The moment I got there, for the 7 years or 8 years that I was around there, I pretty much stayed within the campus. And in moving to London, it was a mere relocation in that sense. But of course, there are cultural differences. Leaving Nigeria was a sort of a sudden break in a sense, because I had begun to develop serious interest in local materials in Nigeria, straw mats and other material like that, baskets and so on, and I was using these in my work. And going to Britain, of course, those materials weren't available. And also I had a feeling that the reception for them would not be the same. Mind you, they had not been enthusiastically received in Nigeria either, but I was determined and I was home, so I could do pretty much what I liked. But being in Britain, I had no access to these materials, and I found myself returning to watercolors, and I didn't want to return to watercolors. So I did them for a while, and then I moved on to acrylics and canvas and board and all of those, and did pretty much a number of things that I liked.
I have moved on, because I did the works on canvas and all the things that I did in Britain and Germany and Australia and all that until the end of 1994. After my last solo show, which was in Sydney, I felt less attracted to painting. And prior to that, a couple of years before that, I had already gone into installation work, because my work generally has always been conceptual, whether it was painting or whatever else I did. And I was always fascinated by the installation form. And I had convinced myself, and I think this is not very far from the truth, that installation as an art form is something that was derived from an awareness of the nature of presentation in African art. Of course, it's the same in every other culture, that you have altarpieces and they're arranged the same way. But I think the installation work that people began to do in the 70s and late 60s and into the 80s and the 90s was directly inspired by their knowledge of African art and its arrangements. So I felt that this was something that was not alien to me. This was much closer home. It reminded me of shrines at home. It reminded me of altarpieces. It reminded me of, the arrangement of furniture in the living room. And I took very much to it. For being African, for whatever it's worth, I am, of course, an African artist. But I'm an artist first, and then I'm an African. In a different context, I'm an African first and then an artist afterwards. One thing, though, is that you can change the identity. I may well cease to be an African tomorrow, depending on what new name comes up, because the name African itself is not even indigenous. My grandfather had no sense of being an African because he didn't even know the word. He was Igbo, and that's it. And in a sense, perhaps he wasn't even Igbo. Perhaps he was just Modimo, Mbise, or whatever local identity.
In spite of the not very positive political climate in most parts of Africa, I think that the artists have managed to create and have continued to create vibrant art, and there is hope that even more will come out of Africa. And I think what the exhibition at the National Museum of African Art has done is to draw attention to the very vital art that is being produced in Africa today.